Please, don't touch me, she wept. The words barely left her cracked lips before her body went limp. Elias Walker froze, one hand still outstretched, fingers hovering above her blistered skin. The desert wind howled around them, carrying dust across the ridge, the kind of dry wind that stripped a man down to his bones. For a long moment, he thought she might already be gone. Then he saw the faint rise and fall of her chest, shallow and stubborn, like a flame refusing to die. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her face was burned raw by the New Mexico sun, dirt caked into every line. A torn blanket clung to her shoulders, little more than rags now, stiff with dried blood. And her belly swollen, not with food, not with health, but with the weight of a child someone had tried to kill along with her. Elias felt the world tilt. 10 years. 10 long years since they had murdered his wife and left him with nothing but a shovel and silence. The killers were never caught. The law never cared. And in those years, Elias had become something less than a man, just another shadow drifting across the ranch lands, working for wages he didn't spend, sleeping in a cabin that smelled of cedar and loneliness. He told himself he was done caring. But kneeling there in the dust, staring at this girl who should have been dead, he remembered everything at once. The night screams, the hollow mornings, the way grief doesn't fade but poisons your coffee and darkens the sky. He saw the same cruelty that had stolen his wife, now carved across this stranger's skin. And something inside him broke. Or maybe it came back to life. The year was 1878. The New Mexico Territory was bleeding from the Lincoln County War. Outlaws roamed the borderlands between El Paso and Juarez, men who lived off fear and flesh. People whispered names like Jesse Evans and Billy the Kid in saloons, while ranchers prayed their fences and families would last another season. It was a time when the law was just another gun, and justice often came from the barrel of a Winchester. Elias knew it better than most. He had fought in the Union cavalry back in '64, had seen what men became when God was no longer in their hearts. He thought he had left all that behind. But now, kneeling in the sand beside this broken girl, her voice echoing in his head, "Please, don't touch me," he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Rage, compassion, the dangerous fire of a man with nothing left to lose, and suddenly one thing worth protecting. For the first time in a decade, Elias Walker did not feel afraid of what came next. He was waiting for it. The cabin wasn't much, just 4 walls of pine that leaned against the wind, a roof patched with tin, and a door that never closed quite right. Some nights the coyotes came close enough to scratch at the steps, and the only thing between Elias Walker and the wild was the shotgun he kept by the chair no one sat in anymore. That chair had belonged to his wife, and for 10 years it had gathered nothing but dust. Now there was a girl in it. Wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled of cedar and horse sweat, Clara May sat stiff and silent, eyes fixed on the fire like she didn't dare look anywhere else. She hadn't spoken since those words out on the ridge, "Please, don't touch me." Elias didn't press her. He brewed coffee the way he always did, poured her a tin cup, set it on the table. She didn't drink. He ladled out a bowl of rabbit stew, left it steaming near her elbow. She didn't eat. Finally, he tossed her a pair of socks that didn't match and muttered, "Better than frostbite." She didn't move. So he split wood until his shoulders ached, cursing at the wind like he had for a decade, pretending nothing had changed, but everything had. Before stepping back outside, his hand drifted to the old chest against the wall. He hadn't opened it in years. The latch groaned when he lifted it, and inside lay the folded prairie dress his wife once wore on Sundays. Simple, worn thin at the seams, but clean. He laid it on the table beside Clara without a word. Her eyes flickered to it, then away. When the fire burned low that night, she whispered fragments. Not a full story, not yet, just enough. El Paso, promises of work, the wrong kind of men. Nights that left bruises too deep to name. Every time she faltered, Elias looked at her, not with pity, but with the quiet understanding of a man who already knew. And when she said she didn't trust anyone, he didn't argue. He just nodded.
"Ain't many worth trustin' anyway," he said. That almost made her smile. Not quite, but close enough. By dawn, she was still alive. That was something. Elias stepped onto the porch, boots grinding against the frost, and stared out across the endless scrubland. For 10 years, he had lived as though the desert might swallow him whole, and he had welcomed it. But now there was a girl asleep in his wife's chair, broken, breathing, carrying a child that wasn't hers to choose. The desert had given him silence for a decade. Now it had given him a reason to load his gun again. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. And drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke and old leather. Its walls leaned against the wind as if weary from holding back the desert for too many winters. Elias Walker carried Clara May through the door, her body light as ash in his arms. He set her down in the chair no one had sat in since his wife was buried. The fire crackled low, throwing long shadows across the floorboards, shadows that seemed too alive for a house that had known nothing but silence for a decade. Clara did not move, not even to take the blanket he draped across her shoulders. Her eyes were half closed, her lips cracked, her skin a map of blisters and bruises. Elias poured water from the tin kettle and pressed the cup into her hands. She flinched. For a moment he thought she might drop it, but she held on, fingers trembling around the metal. She lifted it halfway, then stopped, staring into the steam as though it were a stranger. She did not drink. Elias crouched by the hearth and stirred the pot that had been simmering since dawn. Rabbit stew, thick with carrots and onions. He ladled a bowl and set it near her elbow. The smell filled the cabin, warm and heavy, but Clara kept her gaze fixed on the flames. He could see her jaw tighten every time he moved, like a wounded animal expecting another blow. He didn't speak. Words were useless, he had learned, against grief that went bone deep. Instead, he gave her socks, 2 different colors, one patched at the heel, both better than the frostbiting outside. He tossed them onto her lap without ceremony. Still, she did not respond. Elias stepped away before the silence swallowed him whole. On the far wall stood a wooden chest he had not opened in 10 years. His hand hesitated at the latch, but something about the girl in his wife's chair made him lift it. The hinges groaned, dust rising like ghosts. Inside lay a prairie dress, simple cotton, faded blue. His wife had worn it on Sundays, when they used to ride into town before everything turned to ash. He unfolded it gently, placed it on the table beside Clara. "If it fits, it's yours," he muttered. That was all. The fire popped. The wind pressed against the shutters. Outside, the desert stretched into darkness. Inside, 2 strangers sat in silence, one broken, the other hollow. But Elias knew something had shifted. For 10 years he had lived as if the world had ended. Now, because of this girl who would not eat, would not drink, would not trust, he found himself moving again. He stepped out onto the porch. The night air cut sharp against his lungs. He stared out at the stars, cold, endless, indifferent. His boots ground against the dirt as he muttered, almost to himself, "One more soul to carry." He didn't know if she would survive the night, but she was alive now. And as long as she was under his roof, the desert would not claim her. It was near midnight when Clara finally spoke. Not a story, not even full sentences, just fragments that broke the hush between fire crackles. Elias had been half asleep in the rocker, boots stretched toward the hearth, when her voice cut through the room, raw and uneven. "El Paso," she whispered. Her eyes were fixed on the flames, not on him. Said there'd be work. Elias leaned forward, careful not to startle her. He said nothing. Sometimes silence was the only way a truth could breathe. "They promised. Housekeeping. A roof. Food." Her voice caught like gravel grinding, but it wasn't that, not at all. She stopped, clutched the blanket tighter around her shoulders. For a long moment she said nothing more. The only sound was the wind outside pushing against the crooked shutters. Elias stared at the fire, letting her words settle. He had heard enough lies in his life to know the weight they carried when they broke. She wasn't just talking about broken promises. She was talking about chains, about nights that left bruises where no one could see. Her fingers curled into fists.
"I should have known better," she muttered, almost spitting the words. "But I was hungry. Mama was sick. I thought maybe—" She swallowed hard, then fell silent again, eyes glassy in the firelight. Elias rubbed a calloused thumb across his knee. He knew better than to ask what they had done to her. The bruises told enough. The way she flinched at his shadow told even more. Some truths didn't need naming to be real. "You don't have to tell me," he said at last, voice low, steady. She looked at him then, just for a heartbeat. A sharp glance, wary, almost defensive. But it wasn't anger, it was something else. A test, maybe? To see if he would press her, demand details, make her relive what had already carved her hollow. When he didn't, her shoulders eased by the smallest fraction. "You're not the first I've seen broken by men like that," Elias continued, still staring into the fire. "And you won't be the last, but you're still here. That counts." Her lips parted, as if to argue, but no sound came. She turned back to the flames, eyes wet but unspilled. For the rest of the night, words came in fits. Names she didn't finish, faces she refused to describe. The sound of boots on wooden floors, the smell of whiskey and gun oil. Each fragment dropped like a stone into still water, sending ripples across the silence. Elias absorbed them all, steady as stone, saying little, offering no pity, just presence. When her voice finally gave out, she whispered one last thing: "I don't trust anyone." Elias nodded, not offended, not surprised. "Ain't many worth trustin' anyway," he said. That earned the faintest curl at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, not really, but close. And in that flicker, Elias felt something stir in the hollow place inside him. A reminder that trust was built one ember at a time, and even the smallest ember could fight the dark. The days came slower after that. Winter mornings broke cold and clear, the kind where the sky looked polished, and every sound seemed to carry for miles. Clara May began to move more on her own. At first just to the porch, wrapped tight in the blanket, then later to the pump outside, where she let the cold water sting her hands until the numbness felt like proof she was alive. Elias noticed but didn't say a word. He'd learned a long time ago that healing never came when you pointed at it. It came when you left space for it to happen. He showed her how to split kindling, handing her the axe like it was the most natural thing in the world. She gripped it clumsily, the handle too heavy, her swing weak. The wood barely cracked. Elias stepped behind her, not touching, just watching. "Again," he said. She tried, missed, and cursed under her breath. That pulled the first half-smile out of him in years. By the end of the hour, the woodpile had doubled, more splinters than logs, but enough to make the fire burn through the night. That evening, Clara decided to cook. Elias had no objection. His stew tasted like roofing shingles, and he knew it. She rolled flour on the old table, her hands unsure but determined. Elias sat nearby, whittling a stick, watching the way she worked as if kneading dough could push the ghosts out of her bones. When the biscuits came out of the fire, blackened on the bottom, hard as iron, she frowned. He bit into one anyway. His jaw tightened, but he swallowed. Not bad. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. "You're lying." "Course I am," he said, deadpan. It was quick, fleeting, but she laughed. Just a breath of sound, broken and small, but real. Elias felt it like a nail pulled out of his chest. 10 years since laughter had lived in that cabin. 10 years since anything had cut through the dust and sorrow. The days bled together with small victories. Clara stopped flinching when Elias walked past. She stood a little taller when she carried the water bucket.
Some nights she even slept without screaming awake. The cabin, once suffocating, began to feel different. Still quiet, still lonely, but no longer hollow. One afternoon, she caught him staring at her as she patched a tear in the blanket. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, not angry, just tired. Elias looked away, squinting toward the horizon. He didn't answer right then. Some questions deserved silence before words. He only said, "Because you're still breathing, and that means something." She didn't reply. But later, when she set 2 cups of coffee on the table instead of 1, Elias understood. Trust wasn't a gift, it was a seed. And for the first time in years, something was growing in that house again. The 4th night brought a hard wind down from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, rattling the shutters and carrying the scent of snow. Elias sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the dark like he had done 1,000 times before. But now there was a second chair beside him, and Clara May sat in it, wrapped in his wife's old shawl, her face pale against the moonlight. She broke the silence first. "You ever fight in the war?" Elias kept his eyes on the horizon. Union cavalry, 1864, Virginia mostly, rode under Sheridan. She nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the shawl. "Was it as bad as they say?" "Worse." His voice was flat, carved from stone. "Men don't come back from that the same. Some don't come back at all. The rest carry ghosts." Clara studied him in the dim light. "You lost people?" Elias didn't answer right away. He thought of his wife, of the night her blood soaked into the floorboards while the killers rode away free. He thought of all the faces he couldn't save in the war, the ones that haunted his sleep when the wind howled. "Too many," he said finally. His jaw tightened. "And I've buried enough that the earth ought to know me by name." For a while they sat in silence, the fire inside the cabin popping and hissing through the open door. The night pressed close, heavy with things unsaid. Then Clara turned to him. Her voice was soft, almost lost to the wind. "Why did you save me?" Elias looked at her then, really looked. Her eyes were tired, bruised by fear and pain, but inside them burned a stubborn ember that refused to die. He saw his wife in that ember. He saw every soldier he couldn't drag from the battlefield. He saw himself, years ago, before the desert hollowed him out. His chest tightened. He wanted to tell her he didn't know. He wanted to say it wasn't a choice. But the truth came out rough and certain. "I've left enough people behind," he said. The words hung there, heavier than gunfire. Clara's lips parted, but no answer came. Instead, she looked down, blinking fast. For the first time, she didn't seem quite so small. The wind shifted, carrying the cry of a coyote across the flats. Elias lifted his rifle, checked the chamber, more out of habit than need. "You'll be safe here," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if it was a promise or a prayer. Clara's shoulders eased, just a fraction. And though she didn't say it, Elias felt it in the quiet that followed. She believed him. Or at least, she wanted to. Inside the cabin, the firelight flickered against the cross hanging on the far wall. Elias hadn't touched it in years. But now, as he watched the girl he'd pulled from the desert, he felt something stir, a pull toward the God he thought had long since abandoned him. By the 6th morning, the cabin felt less like a tomb and more like a shelter. Clara May moved with more steadiness now, stepping outside without clutching the doorway, fetching water from the pump on her own. She even hummed once while sweeping the hearth, a sound so unexpected that Elias had to pause with the axe in his hands, unsure if he'd imagined it. But the desert never let a man forget how thin the line was between peace and peril. Elias was mending the water pump when he noticed the first crow, then a second. By the time the wrench slipped in his hand, there were 5 of them circling above the ridge, wings black against the white sun. He narrowed his eyes. Crows weren't scavengers without cause. Something had brought them low. The pump hissed, water spilling over his hands. But Elias's attention stayed fixed on the sky. The birds wheeled tighter, darker, like an omen written against the daylight.
His stomach sank with a feeling he hadn't known in years, the soldier's instinct that danger was already near. He set his tools down slow, wiping grease onto his trousers. The desert was wide, open, endless. Yet sometimes it held eyes. He felt them now, prickling the back of his neck. The porch creaked under his boots as he stepped up, leaning into the shadow of the cabin. From there, he could see the ridge better, long slope of scrub and stone, heat rising off it in shimmering waves. And then, just for a moment, he saw it, a flicker of light, sharp and unnatural. Sunlight bouncing off metal, a rifle scope maybe, or just glass. Either way, it was watching. Elias's hand dropped to the Winchester leaning against the doorframe. He didn't raise it yet. The desert had taught him patience, the kind that could mean the difference between dying and killing. He simply stood there, breathing slow, eyes locked on the ridge, waiting for movement. Behind him, Clara's voice floated from inside. "Coffee's on?" He didn't answer, didn't move. The silence stretched, heavy as a coiled snake. Finally, the glint disappeared. The ridge lay still again, nothing but stone and heat. But Elias knew better.
When he stepped back inside, Clara frowned. Something wrong? Elias set the Winchester on the table, loaded each round with slow, practiced hands. Just crows. She glanced toward the window, her face paling. Crows don't circle for nothing. He looked at her then, meeting her eyes. The fear in her was too sharp to be coincidence. She knew something he didn't, but she wasn't ready to say it, not yet. The fire popped in the hearth. The wind pressed against the shutters. Elias leaned on the rifle, every sense sharpened. Trouble wasn't here yet, but it was close enough to smell. The evening fell hard, the kind of dusk that painted the desert in ash and copper. Clara May was in the kitchen, humming faintly as she shaped dough for another attempt at biscuits, while Elias cleaned his rifle on the porch. The silence between them had grown easier, no longer sharp with mistrust, but stretched thin as the sky darkened. That's when the shot cracked. The bullet slammed into the porch rail, splinters flying inches from Elias's hand. Clara screamed inside. Elias didn't. He moved with the calm of a man who'd been here before, rolling behind the post, rifle raised, eyes locked on the ridge.
Nothing, just the dying echo. Then, from far off, a voice, harsh, drawn out, carried by the wind so it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "She's ours. We're coming for her." The words hit harder than the bullet. Clara dropped the bowl, flour scattering across the floor. She stumbled to the doorway, eyes wide, breath shaking. Her hands clutched her belly as if to shield the life inside. Elias met her gaze for only a second. Then he closed the door gently, steady as stone. "Get some water. We're not done yet." She collapsed to her knees, trembling. "It's them," she whispered, voice breaking. "The ones from El Paso. I thought I'd never hear them again." Elias crouched beside her, his voice low, rough. "You're here now, and as long as you're here, they'll have to go through me." Clara shook her head, tears streaking her cheeks. "You don't understand. They don't stop. They don't quit. They'll burn this place. They'll—" Her words broke into sobs, the fear tearing out of her like something too long buried. Elias placed a steady hand on the rifle. His other reached for hers. His grip was firm, unyielding.
"Then we make a stand."
She looked at him through her tears, her voice almost a prayer.
"Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Yes, I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." Isaiah 41:10. The verse hung in the room like a shield, trembling on her lips, but carrying the weight of something older, stronger.
Elias had not spoken scripture in years, but hearing it now, here, on the edge of blood and fire, something in him steadied. By nightfall, the ranch was no longer just a cabin. Elias moved like a soldier again, every motion measured. He set tripwires strung with lanterns, dug a shallow trench behind the shed, scattered broken branches to mask tracks. He checked the rifle, the revolver, the hunting knife. Every weapon had a place. Every shadow had a purpose. Inside, Clara sat with the shotgun across her lap, whispering the verse again and again, as if weaving armor out of words. The wind howled through the desert, rattling the cabin walls. Trouble wasn't coming. Trouble was already here. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey.
The cabin was no longer a home. By dusk, it had become a fortress. Every corner turned to purpose. Elias Walker moved through it with the slow precision of a man who had done this before, long ago, when orders came from bugles and the dead were carried by wagons. The soldier in him had not died. He had only been buried. Now he was digging himself out. He strung tripwires between fence posts, tying them low to the ground with lanterns balanced on crates. A single pull would send light bursting into the dark, exposing any man fool enough to creep close. Behind the shed, he dug a shallow trench, deep enough to trip a horse or a boot. The shovel bit into the hard earth, each strike echoing like a drumbeat of inevitability. Inside the barn, he checked the old Winchester. He worked the lever smooth, listening to the clean click of iron. He oiled the revolver, slid rounds into the chambers one by one. Each bullet was a promise, not of vengeance, but of protection. He sharpened the hunting knife until it caught the firelight, then laid it across the workbench where his wife once folded laundry. When Clara May peeked through the doorway, her face pale in the lantern glow, she did not see the weary ranch hand who had carried her from the desert. She saw a soldier, shoulders squared, eyes hard, every movement deliberate. For a moment she wanted to speak, to beg him not to fight, but the words died in her throat. She understood. There was no choice left. Elias paused only once. In the corner of the cabin, the wooden cross still hung crooked on the wall. He reached for it with a hand that trembled more than it had with the rifle. His thumb brushed the worn edges, and for the first time in 10 years, he let himself breathe the words his wife once whispered before sleep. "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Romans 12:21. The verse settled in his chest like steel. He did not pray for survival, nor for victory, only for the strength to stand. By nightfall, the sky had turned black, the wind carrying dust and omen across the flats. The cabin stood ready, lanterns hidden, rifle loaded, shovel planted by the door like a grave marker. Elias sat on the porch, the Winchester across his lap, his breath slow, his pulse steady. Somewhere out there, hooves would soon drum against the earth. Somewhere out there, men carried cruelty like a brand on their skin. But here, tonight, the line was drawn. Elias Walker was not running, not this time. Night came heavy, swallowing the horizon in black and copper. The desert was silent in that way it only gets before blood is spilled. Every cricket quiet, every gust of wind holding its breath. Elias Walker sat in the dark on the porch, the Winchester across his lap, his boots planted firm. He did not light a lantern. He let the night cover him like armor. Inside, Clara May crouched in the root cellar, the trapdoor pulled shut above her head. He'd told her it was the safest place, and she hadn't argued, though her hands shook when she climbed down. She clutched the shotgun he had pressed into her arms, her knuckles white against the wood. In the dark, she mouthed the verse again, like a child reciting a lullaby to keep monsters away. "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God." The words steadied her heartbeat, if only a little. She wasn't praying for herself anymore. She was praying for him. On the porch, Elias listened. The desert carried sound far, and he caught it sooner than most would have. The faint rhythm of hooves against the hardpan, distant but closing. One horse, then another, then more. They weren't hurrying. No, they were confident. Men like that always were. He raised his eyes toward the ridge. Shadows moved there, low and slow, slipping between mesquite and stone. The lantern traps sat waiting, their oil full, their wicks dry. One tug of the tripwire and the night would explode with fire. Elias's breathing stayed even. He'd been here before, on fields with thousands of men pressing toward him, on nights when every star overhead looked like an eye of judgment. Tonight was no different, except it was, because now there was Clara, because now he had something to lose. The hoofbeats grew louder, joined by the jingle of harness, the creak of saddles. A low whistle carried across the flats, a signal, answered by another. They were spreading out, fanning around the cabin. Elias shifted his grip on the rifle, feeling the wood solid against his calloused palms. The first voice rose from the dark, mocking, close enough to scrape bone. "You thought you could hide her? She's ours. Always was. Always will be." Elias said nothing. Silence was its own weapon. He let them fill the night with threats, with the swagger of men who believed they owned whatever they touched. Then came the second voice, closer still. "Old man, step aside and maybe we'll let you live." Elias exhaled slow. The cross inside the cabin glinted faint in the firelight, though no fire burned. His thumb brushed the edge of the rifle's trigger guard. He was not moving, not yielding, not tonight. The hoofbeats circled. The cabin groaned in the wind. Clara pressed her lips to the cold metal of the shotgun and whispered the verse again. The storm had arrived. The night shattered with the sound of splintering wood. A shadow lunged from the ridge, boots hammering the ground, rifle glinting in the starlight. Elias Walker didn't wait. His hand yanked the tripwire, and the desert erupted. Lanterns burst open in a wash of fire, flames leaping across the yard, throwing every shadow into sharp relief. For a heartbeat, the darkness was gone, replaced by a blaze of light that cut the outlaws bare. One man stumbled in the sudden glare, blinking, and Elias squeezed the trigger. The crack of the Winchester split the night. The outlaw jerked, staggered 2 steps, then dropped into the dust. His gun clattered from his hand. The firelight caught his face just long enough for Elias to see the smirk still frozen there. A smirk that thought no one would stand against him. It died with him. Another voice bellowed, closer now. "You'll pay for that, old man." Boots pounded against the dirt, circling toward the barn. Horses shrieked, their reins jangling as shadows darted among them. Elias reloaded without hurry, the motion smooth as breathing. He had done this too many times to falter now. The air smelled of oil, smoke, and blood. Every sense sharpened, every nerve alive. Inside the root cellar, Clara clamped both hands over her mouth to stifle a scream. She had heard the shot, the thud of a body hitting the ground. Her heart hammered so loud she feared they'd hear it. She pressed her forehead against the wood, whispering, "God, don't let him fall. Please don't let him fall." Elias crouched low, scanning the yard. Another shadow broke cover, rushing from the far side. He fired once, the shot sparking off stone, missing. The outlaw ducked, cursed, returned fire. The bullet slammed into the porch beam inches from Elias's shoulder, spraying splinters across his face. He did not flinch. He rolled, fired again. This time the man dove back into the dark, retreating toward the barn. The flames from the lantern sputtered, casting long, wild shadows across the yard. The light turned the desert into a maze of movement. Every bush seemed alive, every flicker a threat. Elias steadied his breathing, waiting, counting. The dead man lay still in the dust, his blood already darkening the sand. Elias did not look at him long. There was no time for it. Death was only a mile marker on this road, and there were more yet to come. From the cellar, Clara clutched the shotgun tighter. Her knuckles ached, but she didn't loosen her grip. For the first time, she didn't think of running. She thought of standing. If Elias fell, she would not go quietly. The night had lost its silence. Now it rang with gunfire, with fire snapping, with men cursing in the dark. And Elias Walker knew. The fight had only just begun. The barn doors shuddered under a heavy boot. Hinges squealed as the second outlaw crashed through, a shadow wrapped in dust and rage. He came fast, wild, firing blind into the dark, hoping noise and fury would do what aim could not. Horses screamed inside, kicking against their stalls, the air thick with hay and panic. Elias moved toward the sound, every step measured. He did not rush, did not shout. His rifle stayed steady in his hands, the barrel glinting faint in the firelight still burning from the lantern traps outside. He'd seen men like this before, reckless, drunk on cruelty, convinced fear alone was enough to win a fight. The outlaw stumbled over a feed trough, cursing, and in that stumble, Elias saw his chance. He stepped into the open, boots grinding against the hay-strewn floor. "Looking for me." His voice was low, calm, almost cold. The outlaw spun, eyes wide, teeth bared in a grin that was more snarl than smile. He raised his gun, but Elias was faster. The Winchester thundered, the shot grazing the man's shoulder, spinning him back against the barn wall. He roared, half in pain, half in rage, and fired wildly in return. Bullets splintered wood around Elias, one ripping a hole through the brim of his hat. Still, Elias did not flinch. He shifted left, smooth as water, levered another round, fired again. The outlaw lunged forward, desperate, slamming into him before the shot fully cleared. The rifle clattered from Elias's hands, skidding across the dirt. The two men grappled, fists and fury, boots grinding into the hay. Elias took a punch across the jaw, blood filling his mouth. But he did not fall. He slammed his shoulder into the younger man, driving him back toward the stalls. The outlaw swung again, a wild arc. But Elias caught his wrist, twisting until bone cracked like dry wood. The pistol dropped. For a heartbeat, they locked eyes, one filled with hatred, the other with something harder, older. Elias shoved him back, reached for the knife at his belt, and pressed it to the outlaw's throat. The man froze, chest heaving, sweat and blood mingling on his face. "You think fear wins," Elias growled. "It doesn't, not here." He could have ended it then, one motion, one cut. But instead, Elias shoved the man backward, letting him crash against the wall, broken but alive. Mercy was more dangerous than any blade. It meant Elias was not the man these killers thought he was. The outlaw scrambled to his knees, clutching his ruined arm, eyes wide with disbelief. He spat blood, then staggered toward the barn door. Elias retrieved his rifle, breath ragged, jaw aching. His hands were steady. The fight was not over. But the soldier in him was fully awake now, and he would not yield. The barn door slammed open again. Another shadow surged through the smoke, rifle raised, teeth bared in a grin that promised blood. Elias barely had time to lift the Winchester when the crack split the night. The bullet tore into his side, hot and merciless. His body jerked with the force, knees nearly buckling. For a heartbeat, the world tilted, the lantern light spinning, the smell of hay sharp in his nose, the copper taste of blood flooding his mouth. But Elias did not fall. He braced against the stall post, teeth gritted, vision tunneling to the man in front of him. The outlaw laughed, stepping closer, gun barrel glinting. "Old man, you should have stayed buried with your wife." Elias's grip tightened on the Winchester. Pain seared through him, but something stronger held him upright. A memory, his wife's face in the firelight, Clara's whisper in the cellar, the cross on the cabin wall. He leveled the rifle. The outlaw fired again. The shot ripped across Elias's shoulder, burning like iron. Still, he did not fall. He squeezed the trigger, and the Winchester roared. The outlaw's grin vanished. The bullet caught him clean, slamming him back into the barn wall. He slid down, eyes wide, a crimson bloom spreading across his chest. His gun dropped to the dirt with a hollow clatter. Elias staggered forward, every step a war. He kicked the pistol away, breathing like a bellows, his own blood dripping onto the straw. The barn swayed around him, but he forced himself to stand over the dying man. "Not tonight," Elias rasped. "Not her." The outlaw's eyes rolled back. His body went slack. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of lantern fire outside. Elias's knees gave, and he dropped against the stall, clutching his side. Blood soaked his shirt, spreading warm and fast. The night air bit deep, making the wound burn colder. Then he heard it, the retreat of hooves pounding into the distance. One outlaw still lived, fleeing into the dark. Elias lifted his head, eyes narrowing. He wanted to follow, to finish it. But his legs refused, his body too broken to give chase. Instead, he dragged himself toward the barn door, every inch a battle. He would not die here, not in the straw, not with Clara still waiting below. He forced his body through the pain, step by step, until the cold night air struck his face again. The desert stretched silent once more. One body lay in the yard, another inside the barn. The third rode off bleeding into the night. Elias pressed a hand to his wound, blood slick between his fingers, his breath shallow but steady. He had held the line. But the cost was written in crimson across his shirt, soaking into the earth beneath his boots. The night smelled of smoke and iron. Elias Walker moved like a man already half in the grave, every breath shallow, every step a fight. His side bled freely, staining the dirt black beneath the moonlight. But still he worked. He dragged the first body from the yard, boots scraping across the dust. The outlaw's head lolled, arms limp, face pale under the starlight. Elias didn't look at the man's eyes. He'd seen too many of them already, soldiers and killers alike. He pulled him past the ridge, dropped him into a shallow pit, and shoveled dirt until the desert swallowed him whole. The second he hauled from the barn, leaving a trail of dark streaks across the straw. His arms screamed with pain, his wound burning hotter with every motion, but he did not stop. He took the gun from the man's slack hand, smashed it against a rock until the iron bent and split. The bodies had taken enough lives. There would be no more. At the edge of the flats, he struck a match, set fire to their coats and saddlebags. Flames licked the night, twisting upward like a warning. The desert would not remember their names, nor their cruelty. Only ashes. When it was done, Elias leaned heavy on his shovel, sweat dripping into the blood already soaking his shirt. He stared at the fire until his vision blurred, and then he whispered, not for them, but for her, the girl hiding in the cellar, and for the wife whose absence still haunted every corner of his home. No one's coming for her again. His voice was rough, carried away by the wind. Then, softer still, as if the stars themselves needed to hear it. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Romans 12:21. The same verse he had touched before the fight. Now it was carved into him, deeper than the bullet wounds. The shovel slipped from his hands, his legs gave out, he stumbled back across the yard, the world swaying like a storm-tossed ship. The cabin door came into view, flickering with the faint light of the fire inside. He made it to the step, leaned once against the frame, then collapsed just inside the threshold. Clara May found him there. She had heard the last shot, then silence, then the scrape of boots that never came again. She climbed from the cellar trembling, shotgun clutched tight, and saw him sprawled across the floorboards, blood soaking into the wood. But he was breathing. Barely. Clara knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she pressed cloth to his side. He did not speak, but his eyes found hers, and in them she saw something she had thought lost forever, trust and a strange, quiet peace. She did not cry. She simply held his hand through the long hours until dawn, whispering prayers over the man who had chosen to stand for her when no one else would. And when the first light broke across the desert, Elias Walker was still alive. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The first night passed like a fever dream. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, his breath shallow, his shirt soaked crimson. Clara did what she could, tore strips of cloth, pressed them against his side, whispered prayers with trembling lips. She had never tended a man's wounds before, but she remembered her mother's voice, soft and steady in another lifetime. Keep them warm, keep them clean, keep them breathing. By dawn, the bleeding had slowed. His skin was clammy, his lips pale, but he was alive. That was more than she had dared to hope. Clara fed him broth by the spoon, her hands shaking each time she brought it to his lips, afraid he might choke, afraid he might never swallow again. But he did. Slowly, painfully, Elias lived. Days blurred into each other. Clara hardly left his side. She cleaned the wounds twice a day, boiled water until her arms ached, and kept the cabin fire burning through the long desert nights. When coyotes howled in the distance, she sat on the porch with Elias's old shotgun across her lap, watching the darkness, daring it to come closer. She had been a victim once. She would not be again. Elias, in his waking moments, watched her. Not with pity. He had none left to give, but with something else, respect, gratitude, perhaps even awe. The girl who had been broken in the dirt now stood guard like a sentinel, a light he had not seen in years. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. "You're stronger than you think." Clara blinked, unsure whether to believe him, but she carried his words with her like a lantern flame against the night. Weeks passed. Elias grew stronger, though the pain never left him. He leaned on the wall to stand, shuffled across the room like an old man, but each step was victory. Clara teased him gently, her first real laughter spilling into the cabin like sunlight through dusty windows. He answered with a grunt and the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, not yet. They fell into a rhythm. Clara cooked, Elias criticized her biscuits, and then ate them anyway. He showed her how to mend a saddle strap, how to split wood without breaking the grain. She showed him how to make stew that didn't taste like boiled leather. The cabin, once silent as a tomb, filled with the ordinary noises of life again. Clinking spoons, crackling fire, soft voices in the night. Sometimes Clara would catch Elias staring into the flames, his eyes shadowed with memories too heavy to speak. She never asked. Instead, she placed another log on the fire, poured him a cup of coffee, and sat beside him in silence. That was enough. One evening, after she had finished changing his bandages, Elias rested a hand over hers. His grip was weak but steady. "You've given me more than medicine," he said quietly. "You've given me a reason to stand again." Clara lowered her gaze, blinking back tears she refused to let fall. For so long, she had been told she was nothing but a burden, something to be used and discarded. But here, in this place, with this scarred man who had chosen to fight for her, she was something more. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and dust. Inside, the fire glowed warm, steady, alive. He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds. Psalm 147:3. The verse came to Clara's mind like a whisper, one her mother had read aloud long ago. And now, as she looked at Elias, the broken soldier who had chosen not to die, she believed it might just be true. For the first time in years, both of them allowed themselves to hope. By early spring, the land had begun to change. Snowmelt trickled down from the mountains, feeding the dry creek beds. The grass stretched a little greener across the flats, and the air carried the faint smell of rain. Inside the cabin, change had taken root as well. Elias Walker was no longer confined to the bed. He rose each morning stiff and sore, but standing tall, his hand brushing the doorway like he was relearning how to belong there. Clara had changed too. The girl who once flinched at every sound now walked barefoot across the yard at dawn, feeding the horses with a steady hand. She hummed as she worked, her voice soft but sure, the kind of melody that stitched itself into the morning air. Elias watched her sometimes from the porch, marveling at the strength she had uncovered, the strength neither of them had expected. One evening, Elias brought out his old hunting knife and a block of cedar wood he had stored away years ago. He sat on the porch step, the firelight flickering across his weathered face, and began to carve. Each stroke was slow, deliberate. Clara came to stand beside him, curious, but he said nothing at first. The sound of the blade scraping against wood filled the silence. When at last he held it up, the words cut deep into the plank read, "Walker Ranch." Clara blinked, her breath catching. You mean this is mine too?" Elias looked up at her, his eyes steady, the lines of grief softened by something gentler. "It was never just mine. A home doesn't belong to a man alone. It belongs to those willing to fight for it. You fought, Clara. You stayed. This place is yours as much as it's mine." Her hands trembled as she took the sign. For a long moment she stood there, staring at the carved letters, as if afraid the wood might vanish if she looked away. Then, gathering herself, she fetched a hammer and a nail. With Elias leaning against the porch post for support, she drove the sign into place at the front gate. The final strike echoed across the yard, sharp and sure. Clara stepped back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Together, they looked at the sign swaying slightly in the desert wind. It was not just a name. It was a declaration. The ranch, once a graveyard of sorrow, now bore witness to survival, to healing, to a future neither of them had thought possible. That night, Clara made stew, and Elias burned the biscuits again. They laughed, really laughed this time, until their sides ached. Later, as the fire dwindled to embers, Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, and Elias let it rest there. No words passed between them, but they did not need any. For what mattered was not spoken, it was lived. In the months to come, there would be work, mending fences, tending cattle, fighting storms, and perhaps still fighting shadows of the past. But for the first time in a decade, Elias did not dread tomorrow. He welcomed it. Clara, too, looked to the horizon with something new in her eyes. Not fear, not sorrow, but belonging. As the night deepened, the stars spread across the sky like promises too vast to count. Clara whispered softly, almost to herself, the words she had once heard in a faded Bible back home. "He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds." And Elias, though he said nothing, closed his eyes and believed. Because this was not a story about blood or revenge. It was about what came after, the rebuilding, the quiet strength, the grace to begin again. Sometimes it is the scarred who build the safest homes. And under the sign that now bore both their names, the Walker Ranch stood not as a monument to loss, but as a promise of hope. Stories like this aren't just about the past. They remind us of what it means to be human. Maybe you've walked through your own deserts, carried scars no one else could see, or lost someone who once made your house a home. Elias and Clara's journey isn't only theirs. It belongs to anyone who has ever fought to hold on, anyone who still believes that broken things can be mended. The West was never just dust and gunfire. It was faith, forgiveness, and the stubborn hope that tomorrow might be kinder than yesterday. If this story stirred something in you, friend, then you're in the right place. We share true Wild West stories that aren't only about bullets, but about hearts, about loss, courage, and the grace of God's hand guiding the weary home. Subscribe, stay with us, and let's keep these stories alive, because some wounds heal best when remembered together.